Thank you very much for inviting me to give this presentation, and my apologies that I'm not able to join you in person live. Let me start off by giving my condolences and commiserations to all of you who are Sudanese or have friends and relatives in Sudan who are caught up in this totally needless, horrific, horrendous conflict. Sudan deserves much, much better. The beautiful, non-violent revolution that we saw unfold in Sudan, led by ordinary, unarmed civilians, many of them women, just 4 years ago, shows the type of country that Sudanese are capable of building, in total contrast to the horror that is being inflicted on that wonderful country by these two, let me call them warlords or gangsters. So the current state of affairs, as I'm sure you are all familiar, is egregious violations of international humanitarian law. Most visibly, most horribly in Khartoum, in the three towns, but also in many, many other parts of the country as well. There are attacks on civilians and on civilian infrastructure. The forces of one side or the other are occupying and looting private residences, terrorizing civilians, occupying hospitals, preventing medical staff from doing their essential duties. There are also bombardments, including aerial bombardments of civilian targets. Schools have been attacked and obviously are not functioning. Markets are not functioning. And starvation crimes are being perpetrated at scale. Now, the definition of the war crime of starvation is depriving, destroying, or rendering useless objects indispensable for the survival of the civilian population. So that includes not just food and foodstuffs, but also water and shelter, maternal care for children, and in an urban setting such as Khartoum, objects indispensable for survival also include electricity, telecommunications, and basic infrastructure for the conduct of everyday life. All these are being destroyed, disrupted, and these are crimes for which military commanders and military leaders should be called out and should in due course be held accountable. Let me say a few remarks on the status of the belligerents. They are two non-state belligerents. Neither of them can be said to represent the Sudanese state. There was a coup d'etat overthrowing a constitutional process, a constitutionally recognized government in October of 2021. And quite correctly, the African Union Peace and Security Council invoked the relevant article of its constitutive act and suspended Sudan until such time as constitutional order were restored in the form of a civilian government. And when the two sides signed their declaration of commitment to protect civilians in Jeddah last Thursday, one signed as the Rapid Support Forces, clearly a non-state actor. The other signed as the Sudan Armed Forces and not as the government of Sudan. And that is quite correct. It is not the government of Sudan. It is also a force that aspires to be the government of Sudan, but is not the recognized government. It is merely the Sudan Armed Forces. Now, this is significant, I think, because as the case of Sudan comes to the League of Arab States, to the African Union, and to the UN Security Council, the Sudan Armed Forces will try and clothe itself as the legitimate government trying to suppress a rebellion. And I think we should be absolutely clear that it is not that. And neither, of course, is the Rapid Support Forces. They are both non-state armed actors. And moreover, they have a practical and actual material character that should prohibit them from being recognized as such. They are both forces that have been engaged over the years in deeply corrupt and anti-democratic practices, racketeering, profiteering, kleptocracy. What we are seeing in Khartoum today, it resembles a civil war, but I think it could more accurately be called a mobster shootout. What we have is two kleptocratic systems fighting it out for control of ill-gotten gains. Now, I said I made mention of the Jeddah Declaration of Commitment for the Protection of Civilians, which was signed last week. Was this a step forward or not? Now, in it, all the two parties do is they recognize commitments under international humanitarian law, the Geneva Conventions, the laws of war, that they ought to be respecting in any case. It is merely an affirmation of their existing obligations as belligerents. But there's one thing that I was disturbed to see was not present in this Jeddah protocol. And that was there was no recognition that local civilian humanitarian actors, local Sudanese resistance committees, doctors, local residents actually are the people who are doing the lion's share of the essential humanitarian work. Under normal circumstances, the great majority of humanitarian work in Sudan is done by Sudanese. And under current circumstances, that is especially the case because the United Nations and international humanitarian organizations are thin on the ground. Many of them have evacuated their international personnel. And I think it's very important as a matter of material fact, and because of the ethical and legal obligations on the belligerents, but also as a political affirmation of the role of civilians in Sudan, that the principal preeminent role of ordinary civilians in essential humanitarian action should be recognized and protected. Now, what we've seen in the 5 or 6 days since that protocol was signed in Jeddah is actually, it is not being recognized. There is nothing resembling a humanitarian truce, or even in a limited attempt to permit or to facilitate or enable humanitarian relief to assist those in need. It is, to all intents and purposes, a dead letter. It has been a test of the commitment of those two parties to basic humanitarian principles, and they have failed at that test. Let me make another remark about something else that I'm sure you will be discussing that happened last Thursday, which was the UN Human Rights Council met in a special session to award the Human Rights Rapporteur additional powers to monitor and report on what is going on in Sudan. This might seem to be an unexceptional, routine, quite appropriate step that ought to be welcomed by everybody. Sadly, this wasn't the case. The representative of the Sudan Armed Forces, who was allowed, and I would object to this, he was permitted to address the meeting as a representative of the government of Sudan, objected to this, saying it was a matter of internal affairs only within Sudan, and that Sudan sought an African solution to this problem. And that was an alarming misuse of that phrase. What we saw as well was the Saudi Arabian delegate campaigning, lobbying for the resolution not to be accepted on the grounds that this might impede, might get in the way of the negotiations ongoing in Jeddah. Now, why should basic humanitarian and human rights obligations get in the way of negotiations towards a ceasefire. The idea that it might do so is, I think, reprehensible and indicates that the Saudi delegation was perhaps not acting in good faith when it convened the parties. Perhaps it was not intending to see an outcome that respected the rights of the Sudanese people. Maybe it more respected the privileges of those military leaders who are represented in the talks. But more alarming was the fact that not only the delegate of the Sudan Armed Forces misrepresenting himself as the government of Sudan, but a number of other African delegations also said the same thing. African solutions to African problems meant rejecting the role of the United Nations. And all of the African members of the Council either abstained or voted against. Now, it seems to me this is absurd. The idea of African solutions should not be a pretext for ignoring or downgrading the obligations of African states under the UN Charter, under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and indeed the obligations under the Constitutive Act of the African Union itself. Those same African states have willingly signed on to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, the African Declaration on Democracy, Governance and Elections, and the Constitutive Act of the African Union itself, which has at its center the norm, the principle of non-indifference. This was adopted after the genocide in Rwanda and the failure of the international community, including the African community, to act to prevent or to stop that genocide. The norm of non-indifference obliges African states to act when there are egregious abuses of human rights, crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity, or genocide. And these are things that we are seeing in Sudan, perhaps not genocide, but certainly war crimes being perpetrated. And the idea that African states could fail to act because these are universal norms is absolutely unacceptable. African solutions does not mean the rule of the gun. African solutions means that African states are held accountable to the standards, the principles that they themselves have adopted at the African Union and at the United Nations. So let me conclude by reiterating my condolences for all of the Sudanese who have lost friends, family members in this needless, atrocious conflict, and my sympathies to all Sudanese caught up in this war that they did not want, that they did not instigate. This war must stop, and this war will be stopped in a sustainable way when universal principles of human rights are upheld by the Sudanese in Sudan. I thank you.